The interrogation room smelled of iron and fear, not blood, though Mira had learned to recognize its scent too in the 3 months since the cleansing began. But the iron of the chains bolted to the table, the iron bars over the narrow window, the iron determination of the city that had decided monsters walked among them and must be purged. The overhead light flickered, casting shadows that seemed to breathe against the gray walls. Mira sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, and tried to ignore the hammer of her pulse against her throat where everyone could see it. She'd been poor before the cleansing, poor enough that the rich district's marble facades might as well have been on another planet, poor enough that her mother's medicine came second to rent, third to food, last to everything else that kept him alive in the narrow apartment above the tea shop where Mira worked 16-hour days. She learned to be invisible in the way poor people must, eyes down, voice soft, presence forgettable. The city's elite walked past her like she was fog. It had been a skill, a survival mechanism. Then the cleansing began, and suddenly invisibility became the most valuable currency in the world. The door opened. Inquisitor Thorn entered with a kind of authority that made the room smaller. He was young for his position, maybe 30, with the polished look of someone born into the right district, the right family, the right certainties. His uniform was crisp despite the late hour. Midnight had come and gone while Mira waited, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter ice. Miss Vance. He sat across from her, sliding a folder onto the table. Do you know why you're here? Myra's throat was dry. No, sir. You've been observed. He opened the folder. Inside, photographs. Myra's stomach dropped. They were surveillance images, grainy and time-stamped. Her, standing outside the Obsidian Gallery at twilight. Her, entering the back door of the closed museum at midnight. Her, leaving just before dawn with something wrapped in cloth under her arm. Multiple times, entering and exiting a building that has been sealed by the Inquisition. A building that our intelligence suggests houses a vampire of significant age and power. The word hung in the air like smoke. Vampire. 3 months ago, it would have been laughable. The stuff of old stories, parental warnings, horror films that no one truly believed. Then the first body was found in the financial district, drained and left in the fountain like a discarded husk. Then another. Then 12 more in a single night. And the city learned that the old stories were history, not fiction. The Inquisition rose in response. Part military, part witch hunt, entirely certain. They had methods, they claimed, ways to detect the undead. Holy water blessed by the Archbishop, silver that burned supernatural flesh. And they had names, compiled from centuries-old records and modern investigation. They swept through the districts like a cleansing fire, and Mira had watched from her invisible place as people she'd served tea were dragged from their homes at dawn. Some had been monsters. She believed that. The bodies proved it, but not all of them. I cleaned there, Mira said. Her voice was steady. This, at least, was true. I was hired 6 months ago, before the cleansing. The owner needed someone to maintain the collection while the gallery was closed for renovations. Thorn's expression didn't change. The owner? You mean Alexander Thorn. No relation. Thorn had told her once, with something that might have been dark humor in his voice. Though perhaps centuries ago, in the old country, all the noble families trace back to the same soil eventually. It's almost poetic, don't you think? The hunter and the hunted, sharing a name. Yes, Mira said. You're aware that Alexander Thorn is under investigation. I've heard rumors. Everyone had heard rumors. The Obsidian Gallery's owner was reclusive, never seen during daylight hours, never photographed despite his prominence in the art world. The kind of details that meant nothing before the cleansing and everything after, more than rumors. Thorn leaned forward. The light caught the silver pin on his collar. The Inquisition symbol, a sword piercing a heart. We have evidence that places him in proximity to 3 of the early murders. Witness testimony that describes a man matching his appearance. And of course, there's his complete absence during all daylight investigations. Myra's fingers tightened in her lap. Lots of people work at night. Not like this. Thorn pulled out another photograph. This one was older, sepia toned and cracked at the edges. It showed a group of men in late 19th century dress standing before a building Mira recognized. The Obsidian Gallery, though it had been called something else then. This was found in the city archives. Look at the third man from the left. She looked, her breath caught. It was Alexander. Same angular face, same dark hair swept back from his forehead, same patrician features that belonged on Renaissance paintings. He looked exactly as he did now. Not similar, not like a descendant, exactly the same. This photograph is from 1887, Thorne said quietly. That would make him, at minimum, 160 years old, if he's even aging at all. The static of lies. That was how Mira thought of her ability. The peculiar gift or curse that had marked her since childhood. When someone lied to her, she felt it like static electricity against her skin, a prickling wrongness that made her teeth ache. It had made her a strange, quiet child, an honest but friendless teenager, a young woman who couldn't hold relationships because she knew every small deception, every polite fiction, every kindness that was really pity. It had also made her impossible to fool. Thorne believed what he was saying. She felt no static at all. He truly thought Alexander was a vampire, truly thought this photograph was proof, truly intended to execute him when the evidence was sufficient. People can look alike, Mira said. Can they? Thorne pulled out more photographs. Different eras, different decades, but always the same face. Alexander in 1923, standing with Prohibition-era socialites. Alexander in 1956, at a gallery opening. Alexander in 1989, accepting some award. We found 12 photographs spanning 140 years, all showing the same man, Uneged, unchanged. Before I continue with this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video if you want more stories like this. Write in the comments which city you're watching from, and then we'll continue with the story. The truth was that Mira had known what Alexander was from the first night she'd met him, not because of the photographs or the rumors or the careful way he avoided direct sunlight, but because he looked at her in the dim gallery, surrounded by paintings worth more than her entire life, and said, "You can see it, can't you? What I am." And she had, not with her eyes, but with that peculiar sense that made lies itch against her skin. She looked at him and felt the absence of mortality like a cold wind, the weight of centuries pressing down to the present moment. He was wrong in the way that corpses were wrong, that abandoned houses were wrong. He was a thing that should not be, persisting anyway. "Yes," she whispered, "and yet you came back." He'd smiled then, and it had been almost sad. Interesting. She'd come back because her mother's medicine cost $300 every 2 weeks, because the tea shop paid minimum wage, because Alexander had offered her $500 per cleaning session, cash, no questions asked. She'd come back because poverty made monsters less frightening than starvation. But that wasn't the only reason she'd stayed. These could be relatives, Mira told Thorne. A family resemblance. People have used the same names across generations. We've considered that. Thorne closed the folder, which is why we need your testimony. You've been inside the gallery more than anyone else in recent months. You've seen Alexander Thorne up close, repeatedly, during hours when humans sleep. If anyone can confirm or deny his nature, it's you. The trap was elegant. If she confirmed, Alexander would be arrested, tried, and executed, probably by burning, which was the Inquisition's favored method. The city would celebrate another monster destroyed. If she denied, they would watch her, investigate her, and eventually they would find proof anyway, because immortal beings left traces in a mortal world no matter how careful they were. Unless she could give them something better than denial, something like certainty. "I need to speak with him," Mira said. Thorne's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me. If I'm going to testify about his nature, I should see him one more time, observe him directly. Otherwise, it's just my word against photographs." She held his gaze, kept her voice steady. "You want evidence that will hold up in trial. Let me give you that." Silence stretched between them. Mira could feel Thorne's suspicion like heat against her face, but beneath it was a harder truth. He wanted to believe her. The Inquisition needed witnesses, needed testimony, needed a legitimacy that came from due process even in a witch hunt. 1 hour, he finally said. Supervised. And Miss Vance. His pale eyes hardened. If you're protecting a monster, we will know, and you'll burn beside him. The static of lies was entirely absent. He meant every word. They transported her in an unmarked van as the city slept around them. Mira watched through the barred windows as familiar streets became unfamiliar, the architecture shifting from the cramped density of the poor districts to the elegant sprawl of old money. The Obsidian Gallery occupied an entire block in the historical quarter, a Gothic revival building that looked like it had been transplanted from some older, darker city. Its windows were tall and narrow, its stone facade the color of midnight. During the day, it had the austere beauty of a cathedral. At night, it looked like something that might devour light, for Inquisition guards flanked the entrance. They watched Mira with the flat suspicion of people who'd learned that human faces could hide in human hunger. She kept her eyes down, her posture small, her presence invisible. The old skill still worked, even now. Inside, the gallery was exactly as she left it 3 nights ago. The main exhibition hall stretched vast and shadowed, interrupted by pillars that held up a ceiling lost to darkness. Paintings lined the walls, centuries of art collected by a man who'd watched those centuries pass. Renaissance portraits stared down with the flat eyes of the long dead. Impressionist landscapes held light that would never change. Modern pieces hung in the back gallery like wounds, all red and black and violent geometry. And in the center of it all, standing before a painting of the crucifixion, was Alexander. He didn't turn when she entered, though she knew he'd heard her. Vampire senses, she'd learned, were preternaturally sharp. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the painting with the focus of someone who had all the time in the world. He wore a black suit tailored with a precision that only money could buy, his dark hair falling just past his collar. In the low light, he looked like one of the paintings, too beautiful to be entirely real, too still to be entirely alive. Miss Vance. His voice was low and controlled, with the faintest accent that might have been Russian or Romanian or something older than either. You brought guests. Thorne stepped forward. 2 guards followed, hands on their weapons, wooden stakes. Mira noted with a sick twist in her stomach. The old ways turned out to be the true ways. Alexander Thorne, you're under investigation by the Inquisition for suspected vampirism and suspected involvement in 17 murders. Miss Vance has agreed to provide testimony regarding your nature. Finally, Alexander turned. His eyes found Myra's, and for a moment something passed between them. A question, an understanding, a recognition that they stood on opposite sides of an impossible choice. His eyes were dark, nearly black, and ancient in a way that made her chest ache. He'd told her once that he'd been 28 when he was turned, in a year so distant it predated accurate records. 500 years ago, maybe more. He'd stopped counting. I see. He looked at Thorne. And what will her testimony prove? The truth, Thorne said. We have photographs, witnesses, circumstantial evidence. What we need is direct confirmation from someone who's observed you extensively, someone whose word you'll trust. Alexander's mouth curved, not quite a smile. How remarkably medieval of you. Trial by testimony. Tell me, Inquisitor, do you also employ ordeal by water? Torture until confession? We employ justice. Thorne's hand moved to the silver cross at his neck. We protect the living from the dead things that prey upon them. Noble. Alexander turned back to the crucifixion painting. Though I wonder if you consider that the dead might have reasons for existing beyond predation. Are you confessing? I'm observing that your worldview is admirably simple. Monster or human, predator or prey. No complexity, no nuance, no possibility that something might exist in between. He gestured to the painting. This man was executed for existing in between, for claiming to be both mortal and divine. It didn't end well for him either. Thorne's jaw tightened. Miss Vance, your testimony. Mira stepped forward. Her heart was a drum, her mouth dry. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear, to return to the safety of invisibility. But she'd learned something in the months of cleaning this gallery, of talking with Alexander in the hollow hours before dawn. She'd learned that invisibility was its own kind of death. "I've worked here for 6 months," she said. "I've cleaned every room, organized every collection, cataloged every piece. I've been here during the day." A lie. But Thorne didn't know that. "And during the night, I've seen Mr. Thorne work, eat, sleep." Another lie. "Alexander didn't do any of those things. Not really. I've had hundreds of hours to observe him." And Thorne's voice was tight. Mira looked at Alexander. His expression was carefully neutral, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had tightened behind his back. He was waiting for condemnation or salvation. He was waiting for her to choose. She thought of her mother, sick in the apartment they could barely afford. She thought of the $500 per session, the way it had meant medicine, food, heat. She thought of the city outside, paranoid and hunting, burning people on suspicion and calling it justice. She thought of the bodies in the fountain, the real murders, the actual monsters who'd kill without mercy. And she thought of the night she'd found Alexander standing before paintings of the crucifixion, of martyrs, of saints pierced with arrows and burning at stakes. The way he'd touched the frames like they were relics. The way he'd said once, very quietly, "I remember when immortality seemed like a gift." "I don't think he's a vampire," Mira said. The words fell into silence like stones into water. Thorne stared at her. "What?" "I don't think he's a vampire." She kept her voice steady, her gaze direct. "I think he's a man who keeps irregular hours and has an unfortunate family history. The photographs show a resemblance, not identity. Genetics can be striking, and his reclusiveness," she glanced at Alexander, "is eccentricity, not evidence of supernatural nature." "You're certain?" Thorne's voice had gone very soft, very dangerous. "I've had 6 months to observe him. If he were a vampire, I would have seen signs. Aversion to holy symbols." She gestured to the crucifixion painting. "He collects them. Inability to enter homes uninvited. He's been to my apartment." Another lie. But Thorne couldn't know that either. To discuss inventory. Lack of reflection. "I've seen him in mirrors dozens of times." Each lie built on the previous one. A tower of protective deception. And with each one, Mira felt the absence of static against her skin, because she wasn't lying, not really. She was choosing what to see, choosing to interpret the evidence differently, choosing to believe that the man who'd paid for her mother's medicine, who'd treated her like a person instead of furniture, who'd stood before paintings of martyrs with an expression like grief, that man deserved something other than burning. Thorne turned to Alexander. "Is this true? You've been to her home?" "Yes." Alexander's voice was carefully neutral, but Mira saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "Miss Vance has been an exemplary employee. I visited her apartment twice to discuss the collection's cataloging system. During daylight hours, I should add." The lie was smooth, practiced. Of course it was. He'd had centuries to learn how to lie. But Mira felt it like static against her skin, that peculiar itch that meant deception. He'd never been to her apartment. He couldn't go during daylight hours. Everything he'd said was a lie. Everything except the part about her being exemplary. "You have photographs," Mira continued, pressing the advantage. "But photographs can be altered, and historical research can be misleading. What you don't have is any direct evidence that Mr. Thorne has harmed anyone. No witnesses placing him at murder scenes. No victims with his DNA. No concrete proof of anything except that he looks like his ancestors and works at night. The murders," Thorne began, "were committed by vampires. I believe that. The city believes that. But not every person who works at night is a monster inquisitor. If that were true, you'd have to arrest every security guard, every hospital worker, every artist who prefers moonlight to sunlight." She took a breath. "You asked for my testimony. This is it. Alexander Thorne is not a vampire." The silence that followed was vast. Mira could hear the guards breathing, could hear the distant sound of traffic beyond the gallery walls, could hear her own pulse hammering against her skull. Thorne stared at her with those winder-ice eyes, and she knew he was weighing her words against his suspicions, his evidence against her certainty. Finally, he turned to Alexander. You understand that this investigation isn't closed. We'll continue to monitor you. Any indication that Ms. Vance's testimony is false, any evidence that you've harmed anyone, and we will return with warrants and torches. I understand. Alexander's voice was grave. I appreciate the Inquisition's thoroughness. Truly, in times like these, vigilance is necessary. Thorne's mouth tightened. He gestured to the guards, who moved toward the door with visible reluctance. They wanted a monster to burn, Mira realized. They'd come here expecting confirmation, expecting righteousness, expecting to be heroes. Instead, they were leaving with uncertainty and a witness who defended the accused. At the threshold, Thorne paused. He looked back at Mira, and his expression was almost sad. I hope you're right, Miss Vance. For your sake. Because if you're not, if you're protecting a monster, you'll bear responsibility for every death that follows. Then he was gone, the guards following, their footsteps echoing through the gallery until even those faded into silence. Mira stood very still. Her hands were shaking. Now that it was over, now that the adrenaline was draining away, she felt the weight of what she'd done settle over her like a physical thing. She'd lied to the Inquisition. She'd protected a vampire. She'd chosen to trust that the creature standing behind her was worth protecting. And if she was wrong, if Alexander killed someone tomorrow, next week, next year, those deaths would be her fault. Why? Alexander's voice was very quiet. She turned. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on his face. Something raw and unguarded. Something that might have been hope or might have been fear. For a moment, he looked like what he was, a thing pretending to be human, terrified of being seen. Because you're not the monster they think you are, Mira said. Aren't I? He moved closer, and she saw the truth of him in the low light. The way he moved too smoothly, too quickly. The way shadows seemed to gather around him like loyal dogs. The way his skin had the waxy quality of something preserved rather than alive. I'm exactly what they think I am, Mira. Exactly what those photographs prove. I am ancient and I am dead, and I am dangerous. But you're not a murderer. How do you know? Because I would feel it. She touched her chest, where the static of lies lived. I would know. He stared at her. Your ability. You can sense deception. I can sense lies. And you've never lied to me. Not once. Even now, you're not lying. She took a breath. You're a vampire. I know that, but you're not the vampire killing people in this city. And you don't deserve to burn for crimes you didn't commit. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful control he maintained. For a moment, he looked less like a painting and more like a person who'd been alone for a very long time, wearing a mask that had become his face, until someone looked close enough to see beneath it. They'll come back, he said quietly. Thorne won't stop. He's too certain, too convinced. Your testimony bought me time, but not safety. Then we'll use the time. Mira surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. We'll find whoever's actually killing people. We'll prove it wasn't you. And we'll make sure you can stay without burning. Why would you do that? Risk yourself for something like me? Because you're not a something. She met his eyes, held them. You're someone. And someone deserves better than being hunted for what they're instead of what they've done. The words hung between them, and Mira saw the moment they landed. Saw the way Alexander's careful mask finally, fully cracked. He looked away, and when he spoke his voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it. I was turned in 1523, he said, in Prague during a plague year. I was a painter, not a good one, but devoted. I wanted to capture light, to preserve beauty against the darkness. Then I was attacked, drained, turned. I woke up dead and immortal, and the first thing I felt was thirst, the kind of hunger that would drive me to kill. Mira stayed silent, listening. I killed that first night. A young man, maybe 18. I tore his throat out in an alley and drank him dry and left his body in the street like refuse. Alexander's hands were fists at his sides. I've killed since then. Not often, not indiscriminately, but enough that I have no illusions about what I am. When was the last time? Mira asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment. 1847, London. A man who was beating his wife to death in an alley. I intervened, lost control, and killed him. I've spent the past 177 years learning to feed without killing. Blood bags, donations, willing participants. It's possible to exist without murder, but it requires constant vigilance, constant control. That's why you collect martyrs. Mira gestured to the paintings around them. You're trying to understand suffering, punishment, guilt. I'm trying to understand if redemption is possible for something like me. He looked at her. And then you walk in here and lie to the Inquisition to save me, and I don't know what to think anymore. Think that you're worth saving. Mira took a step closer. Think that 177 years of not killing means something. Think that the monsters murdering people now aren't you, and you don't deserve a burn for their crimes. You could be wrong about me. I could be. She held his gaze. But I'm not. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. But it was true. She felt in the absence of static, in the way her ability stayed quiet in his presence. Alexander was dangerous. Yes. Supernatural, absolutely. But he was trying in a way that the actual murderers weren't. He was choosing to exist without killing, and that choice mattered. He moved closer, and the shadows moved with him. This close, Mira could see the details that marked him as other. The too pale skin, the absence of breathing, the way his eyes caught light like an animal's. He should have been terrifying, but all she felt was a strange, desperate hope that she'd made the right choice. If we do this, he said quietly, if we try to find the real killers, you'll be in danger. The Inquisition will watch you. The vampires will know you're helping me. There's no safety in this for you. There's no safety anywhere anymore. Mira thought of her mother, of the apartment, of the city tearing itself apart. At least this way I'm choosing what to fight for. Alexander studied her face like he was memorizing it. Then, slowly, he lifted one hand and touched her chin, just his fingertips cool against her skin. The gesture was achingly gentle, and for a moment they stood in the vast gallery like two figures in a painting, frozen in a moment that would never quite end. Say that I'm not a vampire, he murmured. That's what you told them. Why that phrasing? Because you asked me to. Mira held very still. That first night, when you knew I could see what you were, you didn't ask me to lie. You asked me to say you weren't a vampire. There's a difference. Is there? Yes, because you wanted me to choose to protect you, not to be forced, not to be compelled, to choose. She met his eyes. So I did. Something happened in his expression, a transformation so complete it was like watching a mask fall away. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart stutter, and when he spoke his voice was barely a whisper. I have existed for 500 years, Mira. I have been alone for most of them, isolated by what I am, by the necessity of hiding, by the weight of all the years. And then you walk into my gallery and see me, truly see me, and choose to protect me anyway. Do you understand what that means? It means I'm either very brave or very stupid. It means you're extraordinary. His thumb brushed her jaw, a touch so light it might have been imagined. And now we hunt monsters together. How cinematic. Despite everything, the danger, the fear, the enormous risk she'd just taken, Mira laughed. The sound echoed to the gallery, breaking the tension, and Alexander smiled in response. It was a real smile, not the careful mask he usually wore. It made him look younger, more human, more like the painter he'd been 500 years ago. Where do we start? She asked. With the murders. We need to understand the pattern, the methodology. Vampires don't kill randomly. There's always a reason, a logic. If we can determine why these victims were chosen, we can identify the killer. The Inquisition has all the files. Then we'll need to get access. Alexander released her chin, stepping back. You're known to them now. Trusted, perhaps, after your testimony. They might share information if you ask. And if they don't, his smile turned darker. Then we'll improvise. I've had 5 centuries to learn how to acquire information people don't want to share. Some skills are timeless. Mira nodded, though unease coiled in her stomach. She'd cross a line tonight, not just protecting Alexander, but committing to helping him, to investigating murders, to deceiving the Inquisition. There was no going back from this. No returning to her invisible life, her quiet existence. She'd stepped into the light, and now she had to see it through. "Tomorrow night," she said, "I'll go to the Inquisition headquarters. Ask to see the files. Tell them I want to help, that working with you gave me insight into vampire behavior. Be careful." Alexander's voice was serious. "Thorn is suspicious. He'll watch you. Let him watch. I'll give him exactly what he expects. A frightened young woman trying to help, trying to do the right thing." She smiled without humor. "I've been invisible my whole life, Alexander. I know how to play the part people expect. You're not invisible to me." The words were simple, but they hit with the force of revelation. Mira looked at him, at this ancient creature who'd been alone for centuries, who collected paintings of martyrs, who was trying so desperately to be something other than a monster, and felt something shift in her chest. Recognition, maybe, or a connection. The sense that they were both trying to exist in a world that didn't want them, that would burn them if it could, and they'd found each other anyway. "Good," she said quietly, "because I don't want to be invisible anymore." The words were a declaration, a choice, a step into the unknown that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Alexander heard them, understood them, and for a moment something passed between them that was more than words, a promise, perhaps, or a warning, or both. Then the moment broke, and Mira was moving toward the door, her heart still racing, her mind already planning. Tomorrow she would go to the Inquisition. Tomorrow she would lie again and better, and she would steal information to protect a vampire. Tomorrow she would become someone other than the invisible girl who cleaned galleries and kept her head down. Tomorrow the Real hunt would begin. But tonight, walking out of the Obsidian Gallery into the cold pre-dawn air, Mira allowed herself one moment of pure, reckless hope. She'd chosen something. Someone. She'd seen a monster and called it a person, and perhaps that made her foolish. Perhaps it would get her killed. But perhaps, just perhaps, it would save them both. The city was waking as Mira made her way home through streets that smelled of bread and exhaust. The poor district was already awake. People moving toward jobs that started before sunrise, children bundled against the cold, and walking to schools that barely functioned. This was her world, gray and harsh and unforgiving. But tonight it felt different, like it might contain possibilities she'd never imagined. In her apartment, her mother was sleeping. The medicine on the nightstand was Alexander's money, Alexander's generosity, Alexander's $500 per cleaning that had meant the difference between managed illness and death. Mira looked at her mother's face, too thin, too tired, but alive, and knew she'd made the right choice. Even if it destroyed her, even if it burned. The Inquisition headquarters occupied a converted cathedral in the government quarter, all Gothic arches, and stained glass repurposed for secular righteousness. Mira approached it with her head down, her hands in her pockets, her posture small and unthreatening. The guards at the entrance were different from the ones who'd escorted her last night, but they recognized her name when she gave it. Thorn left instructions. One said, "Consulting a tablet. You're cleared for auxiliary witness access. 3rd floor, evidence processing." They waved her through. The building's interior maintained cathedral aesthetics. High ceilings, stone columns, the lingering sense of sacred space perverted into something else. People in Inquisition uniforms moved with purpose through the halls, their faces set with the certainty of crusaders. These were true believers, Mira realized. They genuinely thought they were saving the city. Evidence processing was a large room filled with file cabinets, computers, and walls covered in maps and photographs. The murder sites were marked with red pins. 17 deaths in 3 months, scattered across the city in a pattern that made no immediate sense. Some in rich districts, some in poor, some in public spaces, some in private homes. The only consistency was a method. Drained of blood, bodies left in visible places like warnings or trophies. A woman looked up from a computer as Mira entered. She was older, maybe 50, with steel gray hair and the kind of exhausted competence that came from working too many hours on impossible cases. "You must be Vance," she said. "I'm Detective Reeves." Thorne said you wanted to help with victimology. If I can. Mira moved closer, studying the photographs on the walls. They were crime scene images, clinical and horrible. Bodies in fountains, in alleys, in their own beds. Young and old, rich and poor, no pattern she could see. I worked closely with Alexander Thorne for 6 months. I thought maybe I could provide insight into vampire behavior. Reeves' tone was skeptical but not hostile. Into his behavior specifically. If there's a pattern that distinguishes the actual killer from someone who's just being targeted because of what he is. Reeves studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a chair. Sit. Let's talk about patterns. For the next hour, Mira listened as Reeves walked her through the investigation. The murders had started 3 months ago, as she knew, but what she hadn't known was how chaotic they seemed. No consistent timing. Some happened during new moons, some during full. No consistent location type. No consistent victim profile, except that they were all alive before and dead after. It's almost random, Reeves said, frustration clear in her voice. Like the killer is choosing victims on impulse rather than planning. That's unusual for vampires. They're supposed to be calculating, strategic. This feels more like rage or madness. Or a message, Mira said quietly. Reeves looked at her. What? What if the randomness is the point? What if the killer wants to create panic? If you want part 2 of the story, comment down below. Thank you for watching.